Hello, good evening, and welcome. It is Thursday night in the United Kingdom. My name is Teo van Dor. I'm the executive producer of Time of the Sixth Sun, which is a movie and an 8-part documentary series, which I'll tell you more about in a few moments' time. In the window below, we've got Nikki Luna, who is the writer, the creator, the producer of this amazing series that she's worked on over the last 14 years, actually, 11 of it working on the movie and the docuseries that you were able to watch for free. And our guest this evening is Mr. Mike Grenville. Hello, Mike.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Theo. Hi, Nikki.
It's lovely to have you with us. Thanks so much for
having with us.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So yeah, if you've read the description about what we're going to be talking tonight, it's going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I'm just going to bring up Mike's details here. So Mike's got a website, dyingtotalk.org.uk. And you can also follow him if you're on Facebook at facebook.com/sacred transition. I'll put those links into the comments so that you're able to find those easily. And if you're new to Time of the Sixth Sun, so many people joining us. I mean, our Facebook group just went over 28,000 people this week. It's just jumping up. There's so many people finding out about this free launch that we're doing of Time of the Sixth Sun, the movie, and the 8-part documentary series that you are able to sign up to watch. It starts every Tuesday. Last year we did huge launches in April and another huge one in November, like 70,000 people and 80,000 people. But we just we found it so much work to then deal with the support that comes from that. So now we're just launching them every Tuesday. So if you've got friends, family, loved ones that you think would love to be able to watch Time of the Sixth Sun and the 8-part docuseries for free, they just need to go to timeofthesixthsunlaunch.com, enter their name and email address, and then they'll get an email that tells them that the next launch starts next Tuesday. So really simple for you guys to join up. So over to you, Nikki.
Yes. And are we still waiting for people to come in? There's Pamela. Hi, Pamela from Devon. And Hillary and Jeanette.
And Daniel from Arizona. And, you guys are coming in. If you want to let us know where you're from, we love to see that, because it's a real global audience that we've got all over, well, absolutely all over the world. And interestingly, we can show the movie and the docuseries all over the world, apart from in about 3 different countries, one of which is in Indonesia. And I remember it from last year, but I had a lady, she was like, I can't see your movie and the docuseries. What's going on? And I finally thought to ask her the question, where are you based? She went, I'm in Bali. I said, oh, Vimeo won't let you play there. But there was a way around that as well. But it's so lovely to have everybody join us from all over the world. So Eileen's just joined us from Seattle. And Sophia is here from Poland. So, Mike, you are live with an international audience.
Exciting. Great
to have you on the show. I thought we'd start, Mike, with what's present for all of us right now. So tell us from your perspective, what on earth is going on in the world right now?
If only I knew.
Is that a no comment or a pass?
Well, what is going on in the world? I don't know. And what do we ever really know about anything?
I thought,
I mean, what do we really know? I mean, we hear some events and so on, and we think, oh, this is a good thing, or we hear some other events, oh, this is a terrible thing. And I don't know if your other guests have told the story that many of you may know, maybe some people don't know, the man who had a horse and a son. And you know that story?
No.
You must know that story. Anyway.
I do, but I'd love you to share it.
Okay, well, he has a son, and he sends his son off to the mountains for his horse to graze. And the next day, the son comes back with the horse, but with another horse, a wild horse. And the villagers come to him and say, oh, you are so blessed, your son, he brought back this other horse. And he says, I don't know, good news, bad news, who would know? Who would know? And so anyway, the next day, the son sets off to tame the horse, and is thrown from the horse and breaks his leg. And the villagers come to him and say, oh, no, what terrible news. He says, I don't know. Good news, bad news. Who would know? Who would know? And there is a war going on not far away from the village, and the soldiers come and drag all the young men and the older men off to war, except for his son, who has a broken leg. And the villagers come to him and say, how blessed you are. And he says, I don't know. And so it goes on. It's a story without end, and we have this. So we have this news and we say, oh, it's terrible news. But what's really going on? Something, if we have a small story of something, if we have a small perspective of something, we can see one thing. But if we have a bigger perspective, then we can see other things going on. And, often in these kind of circles, we talk about, we want change. And so change happens. We say, oh, no, not that change. I didn't want it to be messy or anything like that. I just wanted to wake up and, while I was sleeping, the angels had come down and sprinkled fairy dust over everything, and it was all fine. I didn't have to do anything, change anything, but somehow miraculously it was all sorted out, and if we look into how change happens in nature, you have something that is solid. I mean, I don't know, let's think of mud, for example. You have to have some solid ground and so on. And yet, the plants, the seeds can't penetrate to plant in it. The insects can't move about in it. And then big rains come. And then suddenly it's all mud and it's all loose and fluid and things happen and so on, So if you want, when change happens, there is an unsettled state that happens. It's a phase transition where you go from a solid state into a mixed state into a new way of being. You think of a chrysalis and a butterfly emerging and so on. The whole thing melts down and you say, oh, it's a terrible tragedy. I had this lovely little wriggling thing and now look at it, it's just a mess, it's a goo. But out of that emerges a butterfly, so we don't know.
Oh.
So we can...
It's a beautiful metaphor.
Yeah, it really is. So, Mike, do you think that society in its current structure has reached its limit?
Reached its limits? Well, I don't know. That if you say it's reached its limits, then you're saying, well, then we're reaching some cataclysm or something where it can't function anymore. But I'm more
thinking has the sort of the 4 months that we've just been through, has it fundamentally changed the way that we as a global population look at things?
Well, it's probably too early to say, but for sure, things already we have already found out things have already happened that will stay with us. That's for sure. To what extent we don't know. One thing we know is that it's been made much more apparent what a global family we are. Something happens in one place, and then you can like see it traveling across the neurons across the world, and this country hasn't, nothing's happened here, and this is happening here, and then people are responding in this way here. So the global nature of something and the interconnectedness of something is now really, really obvious. And I think in some parts of the world, it's very easy to think that everywhere is like where you are, but in some parts of the world, people are already very community and connected in their communities. But in the western part of the world, and I'm speaking in England, people are their level of connectedness in their communities is very mixed. It varies to a great deal. And I think in many streets of the country, there are exceptions, but people don't know many of the people who live in their own road. But I think that what's happened in the last weeks is that a lot of that has changed. A lot of that has changed. People have started to connect with their neighbours and so on, and check in on their neighbours. The town council, I live in a place called Frome in Somerset, and the town council sent out a leaflet, which I also helped deliver, which says, check in on your 5 nearest neighbours. And then the people who were wanting to isolate were invited to contact the town council and say, we will arrange somebody to come and do your shopping for you. I'm still doing the shopping for somebody who's isolating, as are many others in the community, and just checking on people. So, that kind of, when you make a connection, it doesn't necessarily get broken. So that's just one little example. I think another one is the people have enjoyed cycling, and people cycle when it feels safe. And so how do we make that more safe?
Yeah.
And also because public transport, people don't want to go back crowded into public transport. So people are going to say, well, I could drive, but then I'll become part of the problem of creating congestion. I could cycle. And a lot of councils, town councils in this country and around the world have been creating pop-up cycle lanes. Some of those will go, some of them will say, look, why don't we just keep it like this? So yeah, there are signs, I think, like that, of things that have changed already, that may be the seeds for a change in the way that we are with each other. And so when you say, have we reached the end, this story of the coronavirus is nowhere near the end of it yet. So it's too early to say, what lessons we've learned, but clearly there are lessons and things that we're learning already, I think, and some of them really, really positive.
How I understand that is, our structures, like governmental structures and NHS and things, are they reaching their limit because some things are no longer working, or they're overwhelmed, or they need to change? That's how I understood that.
Yeah.
In our village here in Forest Row, we've been witnessing amazing solidarity, haven't we, Theo? Helping struggling businesses in the community that are all having to shut down, trying to find other ways they can serve the community, in a different way. And like you said, assisting the aged with medication and food drops and phone calls. So this sort of emergency is more almost like an emerge and see. Mm-hmm. Emergency when we step out of our bubble. Mm-hmm. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, why has it taken a global situation like this to wake us up to stuff that's right in front of our eyes? Really, we couldn't have made this up, could we? Couldn't have made it up. What are your thoughts on that, about other things that could have precipitated a mass awakening? Because that's really what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the signs are there, and the seeds are there, but sometimes they look for an opportunity to flourish and to come out. So these seeds and this desire to connect with people is all there. I remember a few years ago, a group in Tooting called Transition Tooting. And they organized what was called a Trash Catchers Carnival. Over a year, they developed all the carnival floats and everything. It was all out of rubbish, and they engaged all the schools and so on. And so all of the community came together Tooting is in South London. I remember there was, in the feedback session afterwards, was saying how, a lady saying, she was walking along holding this little boy, and he says, oh, in that door there, I go for, on Saturday mornings, I go for, I don't know what the right word is, but anyway, he goes for Quran lessons and so on. And it was just an anonymous door on the high street that she had no idea. And so all these things that, just an example of little connections that were being made in the community that weren't connected before. So all of these things are there. Community comes about when you do things together, and perhaps that's what this has provided us with, is an opportunity to do things together. Before, we didn't have the excuse to go and check in on our neighbours so much. It was harder to go knock on the door. Are you okay? Yeah. But now it's okay to go and say, oh, are you okay? And I think sometimes we need an opportunity, and that's why we talk about sometimes people as leaders, and it's because sometimes somebody has done something. And then people say, oh, you could do that thing. I could do that thing too. Because somebody has done that thing. I could too. So, there's an opportunity.
It just takes one to break out of the circle for others to follow and go, oh, yeah, light bulb moment. Mm. Yeah. So, thank you, Mike. So, I've been thinking, and why I really wanted to get you on the show is, in the past 20 years, I've personally worked with several patients and families who had someone in the family dying, and have participated in helping them through the dying process. And I always thought it really strange, there's all these people here when we're born to bring us into the world, the gynecologists, the midwives, the pediatricians, the birth doulas, but no one really to take us out of this world. And I suppose in the last 2 decades, there's been a sprinkling in the hospices of death doulas or someone working on that level who escort us on that journey, that onward journey experience. So you work you call it a dying doula. Other people know it as a death doula.
Yeah.
So what does that entail, Mike? What's your role as a dying doula?
Well, it varies greatly. I think, as you said just now, there isn't really a tradition in the West in general of getting other people involved when somebody is dying. Generally, what happens is that the family circle the wagons, and only the closest family are allowed in to see that dying person. So that's what happens. So the idea of bringing somebody in, unless you're maybe on your own, or you're struggling or something like that, or you've been exposed to it in some way.
Yeah.
Generally, for me anyway, I don't get called in at those dying situations, but people contact me and say, my mother, my aunt, my whatever is dying. What do I do?
Okay.
And how can I make that a good death? Generally, it's a bit late, but in the day. But when it's blindingly obvious that the person is dying. But so what I find, and that may vary with other doulas and dying doulas and soul midwives, which is a similar kind of thing. I think it really I think for me, what it says, I'm okay to talk about death. Like, it's all right. Ask me how.
Your badge.
Okay, yes. Talk about death with me. Ask me how. Well, ask me how. That's a different conversation. But ask me what happens. But and I think that's the thing, and that's what I find doing most is talking about it and giving people an opportunity to feel heard, because so often people don't feel heard around this subject. And I know in the blurb that you've put up about me, I hold sometimes these sessions we call Dying to Talk, I create a space for a small group of people to share, to talk about their experience, and to feel really, really heard about their experience of whatever it is around death and dying. And so many people come and say, oh, this is the first time I really felt heard, because my friends don't want to hear about it anymore. But I'm still stuck in this trauma, because we live in a death denial society, the whole society, and this death denial is something that's taught. It's taught at an early age. It's not something that's taught in schools, but it's taught in the way that we treat everything. This is a big question that we're kind of going on to. How do we get here?
Yeah, I noticed with my mother, who passed a couple of months ago, and we'll move on to that later, but I talked to her for the last 2 years about dying, everything I understood about the dying process, people who'd had near-death experiences, how they were all very similar situations. And she said to me one day, she said, thank you so much for talking to me like this. She was so grateful, because the care home seemed to just, they absolutely do not want to talk about it, the carers. My sister, not able to talk about it. My nephew's not. So that gave her a lot of peace of mind, being able to just talk to someone about it. And it really helped to prepare her as well. She had Alzheimer's, so I had to keep repeating things over and over again. Yeah.
I know when my dad died in a nursing home, and I remember, going to visit him, and then you'd be sitting in the lounge with all of the other residents there, and suddenly it would be a sunny day, and suddenly one of the care home assistants would come in and say, "Oh, it's a bit bright in here today. We'll just close the curtains." And I know exactly what was happening. Somebody had died, and the coffin was being wheeled out, and no one was to know. It was a secret, and Phil, who sat next to me yesterday, well, he's not going to be there tomorrow, but there'll be no sad farewell or anything. And I know when my dad died, I wanted to wash and bless and dress his body, and I think I was the and two of it was a lovely care home. And two of the care assistants came and helped me, and I was invited by the matron of the place to choose which of the ones, because my dad had been there for a year or more, and so I knew them all quite well, and I chose the two that I really wanted, and it was very beautiful. But I'm pretty sure I was the first person who had ever wanted to do that themselves. I had a similar experience where I was invited by a friend of mine when her mother died, and her mother was in the care, it was in the with the funeral with the undertaker, and she really wanted to do the same thing. So she wanted myself and my partner Celia to come and wash and bless the body of her mother with her participation. So we contacted the funeral director, who had been a funeral director in this village for most of his life, so a very long time, and he said, "Oh, I think it's illegal. But I'm about to retire, so I don't mind." And he's like, what is possibly illegal? But that tells you that we're in a death denial phobic society. Nobody had come and asked to do that themselves. They wanted it all done for them.
I think a big problem with care homes is that they do a very good job at the physical care of someone and their needs to eat and be cleaned, etc. But on an emotional level, I think it really leaves a lot to be desired.
Well, there is a Portuguese saying that a fish rots from the head down.
Yeah.
And there's the outer society, which is death denial, but then you have the structure within the care home as well. That's how the mood is set of how we deal with stuff here. And
we went to a funeral and a cremation of a friend that passed about 3 years ago, and it was only afterwards my wife Olivia said, she was like, "This is so unceremonious." She said, you walk into this room and then somebody reads a eulogy, which is beautiful, but then in a cremation in particular, the curtains open, the coffin rolls away, and then the curtains are closed, and everybody walks outside, and it's just like there's that incredible lack of care. It's and I know that unfortunately it's a system, and these places often are so busy. It's
no longer fit for purpose. There you go.
They're running, they literally run like machines, and you've got a group of mourners outside, and there's another group queuing up behind them, and it becomes it's
run to a very tight timetable.
Yeah, it is timetable.
But if you overrun, you can get fined by the establishment. So my advice if anybody comes to me and says, we want to organise the funeral and somebody's going to die and so on, is look. Don't have the funeral at the crematorium, because there you'll have probably a 30-minute slot, and that includes 5 minutes for going in and 5 minutes for going out. And you might book a double slot, but you've still got that time going in because you've got a lot of people, so it's going to take longer to go in and longer to go out. And so on. And if your closest relative or something is late, you're stuffed, because you've got to start bang on time and finish on time. So my advice is always don't have it there. Have the committal there. Have the final, the final farewell there, with maybe just a small group of friends and family there. But have the main event somewhere else, where you're not bounded in the same way with time, and you have room to do something.
Is that called a home funeral?
It could be called
a home funeral. So somewhere else other than I didn't know you could do that.
You can do it anywhere. You can do it in the village hall. You can do it in a hotel. You can do it in your garden. You can do it on the Ashdown Forest. You can, we have so much freedom around death in England, in particular. Rules vary in different countries, recognizing we have a global audience, so they vary in different places, but we have a lot of freedom. I mean, you can be buried on your own land in this country, and you don't need to seek permission for that. You need to register it in case somebody digs it up later on.
I didn't know that. I thought that was illegal.
No, not illegal at all.
I didn't know.
No, but if it's a small garden, it might be a problem when you come sell the house and so on. But yeah, you can be buried on your own land. What you can't do in this country and in most other countries is you can't cremate. Because the problem, one of the main problems is because we're now so toxic as humans, particularly with mercury fillings and all that kind of thing, that the crematorium have to have all these filters on to filter, make sure that doesn't get out into the atmosphere when you're being burnt.
Fair enough.
So that is an issue.
Well, that's really a great thing to learn. So, Mike, we're seeing a lot of death in the world right now, and many obviously dispute the figures, believing that they've been manipulated, and it does seem that in many countries that could be the case. But facts are facts. There are people, especially in the poorer countries in the world, who are dying by the hundreds of thousands across the world. Many indigenous tribes have very high death figures. So how can we work with the collective grief in the world at the moment en masse? So many of us believe in the power of mass meditations and collective prayer. Would this be effective, or is it more about coming to a peaceful place within each of us where we're comfortable with the reality of death and we deal with our fear and phobia about dying? I know you've got a lot to say about that and where you think it stems from. So maybe you could talk about that.
There's avoiding death and a fear of death. And the fear of death is really a fear of what happens next. If you're sitting under a tree and you hear the branch creaking, you rush to avoid the branch falling off you. That's a natural reaction. But a fear of death is because you're frightened of what will happen next. And that's a fear of a judgmental God who is going to punish you into hell forever and ever afterwards. So that's quite a different thing.
Or a not knowing. It's not necessarily a Christian thing.
Well, it's fear. Well, I think, it's based around some fear of what's going to happen next. It's pretty much a judgmental thing that would create that. Otherwise, if it's going to be a nothingness, well, it's it's not going to be very painful.
That was my mother's fear. She didn't have many spiritual bones in her body, put it that way, and she just thought she would say, "That's it. When you're dead, you're gone." And it's like, don't think so. Investigate it more. But that was her fear, is that it's then all over, and she didn't. It was a bit FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
Her fear wasn't of a Christian God going to punish her or anything.
Yeah. Well, that's good. You asked the question about, how do we, as a collectively, how do we face this? Well, we began with a story about not really knowing what's going on. Because one thing is we are all going to die. And it's just a question of when.
Yeah.
But life is not going to die. It's when we've become identified with me as this flesh encapsulated ego and so on, as separate from everything else. That's my fear of dying, that I'm going to die. But within all of us, there is the same I. When you get down to it, it doesn't say I, me, my Mike, or I, me, Nikki, or me, Theo, or it's just I. So that I-ness, that me-ness is the same. There is only one. We talk about oneness. That's what oneness means.
Yeah.
And when we think that we're separate, then we think, it's like the fingers on the hands. Oh, they're all separate. But, they're all on the hand. So they're not really separate at all. It's just an illusion. So if we have that sense of separateness, and we have that, I think we have in the West, we've lost that. And I think there's a point where it really happened. I think, which I don't want to bring too many subjects in the same question, but there's a point where it happened where we stopped having a connection to the past and that connection to the future, that connection of the great stories of what the previous generations did and our responsibility to subsequent generations. And it has very huge implications. I mean, this brings us on to how do we get so death phobic?
Let's talk about that, because I think it is an amazing theory that you have about why we're so phobic about death.
Mm.
So let's talk about war.
Yeah, I think war. War is talk about war. It's interesting. My parents were of the lived through the war in their different ways, and their way of coping with that was not to talk about it. But that denied them their grief, and it denied me my knowing, and it has meant that as I've got older, my desire to know more and to understand the way that they were, because of the influences and things that happened to them, has only grown. So I've found myself having to deal more and more with the trauma, with the trauma and the passed down trauma of the war. But I think there is a very specific point, I think, around the First World War, which was the Great War, supposedly, war to end all wars, supposedly, because it was so calamitous in its effect. And we'll talk. I want to talk some other things, but I want to make sure I don't forget this part of it. But I think because what the trauma of that war did was it stopped the grandparents and the elders telling the story of the great deeds that they did to the next generation and the next generations. Those stories of the great, what your father did and your grandfather did and your great grandfather did, that storytelling stopped because no one wanted to relive the experiences. They had no knowledge of post-traumatic stress. So the way that they had to cope was to man up and to, just not talk about it. And at the end of the First World War, which was 100 years ago, something else happened, which is a very great resonance to what's happening now, of course, was the Great Flu Epidemic that happened, where more people died with that than actually died in the First World War, which is interesting. And it was called the Spanish flu, incidentally, because Spain did not engage in the First World War and didn't have press censorship. The Spanish flu, so-called, was actually thought to originate in America and was brought over to Europe by American soldiers who were joining the fight. But that's another story. But that's why it was called that. So once again we had some.
Is that because the Spanish were the only ones who reported about it in the newspapers?
Correct.
So they assumed that that's where it sprung from.
People said, "Oh yes, it's happening in Spain," and denied the deaths that were happening. And also, unusually, it affected young, healthy adults, and it had a very rapid death result. So you could. I remember reading a story of a chap who seemed to be fine, got on the bus to go to work, had a bit of a long journey. By the time he got to the end of the ride, he was dead. The flu came upon people and they died, really over a very short period of time. So that has a kind of resonance. Now, the other trauma that happened to people in Western Europe, in Britain, and in Britain in particular, was that there were no war dead were brought back from the continent, from wherever they died. The army realized very quickly that it was going to be problematic. You couldn't even bring back officers who could afford to do it, because that would create problems. So people weren't brought back. So you can imagine that people were reported as dead, and then some people turned up still alive, and so on. So it was a trauma that went on. You're not allowed to talk about it. So many funerals, and then now we have this epidemic. The whole thing got traumatized. So how you deal with mass trauma, not talk about it, went into their children, which roughly translated was, certainly for me, my parents' generation.
Yeah.
And that's certainly how my parents responded to it. And I might come back to some things on them perhaps afterwards. But
that continued into the Second World War then, didn't it?
That's what I'm saying. So how they dealt with that. So the Second World War, for many people also, don't talk about it. And I mean, and that happened very quickly. I remember reading, there was a book I read not very long ago called, it was called Les Parisiennes, rather, I beg your pardon. It was about French women in France during the Second World War. And many resistance fighters and other French women were sent to Ravensbrück, which was a particularly brutal concentration camp. And at the end of the war, the French prisoners of war were released and they came home. But the women from Ravensbrück, I forget exactly why, but I guess they had to, maybe they weren't well enough to travel initially and so on. Anyway, they came back to Paris and to France a bit later. And then when they came back, nobody wanted to hear their stories. Said, look, we've heard these stories. You know, the soldiers have told us all these terrible stories, and we don't want to hear yours anymore. So they were, you know, they were dismissed and had to silenced and so on. So very quickly, people wanted to get up and get on and look to the future. And, you know, no one wanted to relive the trauma of these stories. And, you know,
and also no graves, I guess, you know, with all the soldiers, many of them not coming home, you didn't have bodies to grieve. So you never completed that process, I imagine.
Yeah, I was thinking it's the lack of closure that would be the most horrible thing for the loved ones.
And also the mass migrations that occurred, and also with the annexation, the east and west borders, so huge. You know, I think one of the greatest migrations in history at the end of the war as well. My mother in 1940 was one of 8 million French people who tried to walk south to evade the invasion. And with her brother, who subsequently left to join the Free French. She never saw him again. And her mother, who died of tuberculosis during the war. And so that was something that she would never talk about. I know a few tiny details. And, you know, for me, this was 80 years ago. This year was May 1940. And I had planned myself to recreate the walk. I knew that she walked from just outside Paris, where she was, to Orléans. It's about 120 kilometers. And I was planning to do that walk. But lockdown happened, and I haven't. So for me, that was a closure that I was hoping to have that reconnection.
Yeah.
So I've had to put that. Hopefully, I can do that next year.
Yeah.
But you know, so that was that walk was going to be part of my journey of reconnecting with a story that my mother would, you know, even though I asked her, she would never. It was too painful for her. The whole thing was too painful. And then, but before I forget, the other thing about the Second World War, the thing that happened in 1945 in this country, and that was copied by other countries, was the marvelous National Health Service, the creation of the National Health Service. But the unintended consequences of that were two things. Birth and death were taken out of the community into the hands of institutions and professionals. And in that process, we were further disenfranchised. And so now we hand over responsibility to these professionals all the time. You know, it's great, but, you know, great, wonderful lifesaver. I don't want to knock the NHS in any way, but, you know, we particularly around death, you know, we hand all of the, you know, I was cycling through a village a little while ago, and there was a funeral directors in the village, excuse me. And there was a sign that had the name of the funeral director, but in bigger font, it said 24-hour service. 24-hour service. What does that mean? That is a sign that says, oh, we live in a death-phobic society. We live in a death society, because if somebody dies at 2 o'clock in the morning in your house, you can be sure if you ring us, we will be there by 2:30 and take that body away from you. That's what that's saying. Otherwise, why do you need to call them in the middle of the night? You don't need to call anybody in the middle of the night if somebody dies. You just sit with them and hold their hand.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to happen. When my mother died,
that's true.
I sat with her for about 10 days, left her in her bed until my sister could come and from another country, from Austria. And I just left her there. And, you know, you can do that. And, you know, if your partner, your whoever it is, dies in hospital, you can claim that person back.
It's also a most magical time to be around when someone has passed and breathed that exhaled that last exhale.
Yeah.
It is such an honor, in my experience, to be with that body. Then you can feel the spirit close, but you can feel it leaving. It's to actually feel the life empty out of a body. That is also part of the process, an important part of the process.
It is. Yeah, it is. So I don't know. We started talking about war, and there are probably more things to talk about.
Well, okay. Well, I'll get on to them. So, are we saying
okay.
that unhealed trauma
Mhm.
from? I know my grandparents didn't talk about the First World War, and my dad didn't talk about the Second World War. All of us hardly heard anything.
Mhm.
So there's all this unhealed trauma and post-traumatic stress syndrome, unhealed, that we then, the next generation, took on. We've taken on that from our parents. So is there genetic proof that we are holding that genetically in our bodies?
There are studies. There's one I remember which was done on mice, and they gave the mice an electrical shock, but at the same time they introduced the smell of cherry blossom.
Huh?
And the grandchildren of those mice, you only had to introduce the smell to produce the reaction.
Wow. Yeah.
And they've done studies also on the children of Auschwitz survivors, and compared them to Jewish children whose parents weren't, and so on. So, yes, there are studies. There are probably more, but the epigenetics is fascinating. And
so I have a personal
story. We lose the story, but we have the impact. Sorry.
Yeah. I have a very weird, very personal epigenetic story to tell. I was, my mother was a kinder transport child.
Oh, wow.
Children were brought over. And I always thought in my mind she'd come into Paddington Station, because she used to tell us how she'd sat there waiting for the people to pick her up, and they never came. And she was sitting on her suitcase. So I was thinking Paddington, but actually it was Liverpool Street Station. But I didn't know that.
Right.
And my ex-partner and I were doing a concert and some therapy work in Germany. So we went to Liverpool Street Station to get the train to Stansted Airport.
Oh, okay.
And we walked in. I recall walking into this big hall, this big station, and suddenly I look around and he wasn't there. We've got all our baggage and instruments on this cart. I'm a seasoned traveller. I've travelled all around the world on my own. And I remember seeing the clock, and I could hear it tick, tick, tick as it went round, although it probably wasn't like that at all, but it was very real to me.
There was a big clock there.
People rushing past me, and so I started to cry. By the time my boyfriend came back about an hour later, 5 minutes later, I was in hysterics, totally abandoned, totally bewildered. And he was looking at me saying, "What on earth is wrong with you?" We got our ticket and got on the train. I was bereft, totally bereft. And, we talked about it, and I think came to the conclusion that was my mother's memory. I picked up for that 5 minutes being in that place, her total distress. If you imagine a 9-year-old arriving on a platform, being the enemy, not speaking any English, and the people who were meant to collect her didn't come. So you can imagine that trauma in that child. So I think that's what I experienced, because you couldn't explain it any other way.
So I mean, you didn't mention, but there's a statue there in the station. I
know that now. I didn't know that at the time.
Oh, there's a statue just outside the station to the Kinder Transport. I can't remember the name of the man who created it, but there's another one which I've also, because when I go to Liverpool Street Station, I take the train to Harwich and then ferry to Hook of Holland, and they came from the Hook of Holland. So there is another one close to the port in the Hook of Holland, where the ferry came across with them. And there is another one in Berlin, and there is another one in Prague. So there's
Berlin is where my mum came from on the train.
Well, that's gosh, I never knew that about you, Nikki. And so there are.
It was important for me when Mum passed that I did a ceremony on the morning I knew she was being created during lockdown.
Yeah, great.
Oh, that's lovely, Teo. I've actually got a picture of a magazine in Germany sent it to us of my mother standing there at the station with all the children having just got off the train.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So it can stay in your body memory. We do carry these traumas. We might not recognize it as a memory. So you were saying about in hospital about in 1910.
I have a similar story.
Go on, please.
In the, my mother lived under occupation, and her brother went off to join the Free French, and got killed for his troubles. I've always felt actually that I'm him reincarnated. I've come back as him to be with my mother. And when I was a teenager, I used to find it very difficult if I was in town when just after the shops had closed. Towns often emptied really quickly, and that would make me feel very uneasy. It would be like I could feel, there could be troops marching around the corner any minute now. It was a really, really uncomfortable moment for me. That was very strong. That was something that came.
So lockdown brought that up for you.
Yeah, and then it was interesting. And then when I got into my 20s, then the story faded. But it was like my brother, my uncle rather, my mother's brother. Yeah, that was when he was killed. So it's like that story. Oh, okay. It felt. Yeah, okay. I haven't been in my mid-20s. I wasn't in my mid-20s in my last life.
Gosh.
It's amazing, isn't it, when you actually start to think about these things and just, how much do we bring through in our DNA? How much stuff are we dealing with in our lives that actually is not our stuff to be dealing with? It's processing, constant until the inhale doesn't follow the exhale. It just seems to go all the way through.
There's a very good book on this kind of subject. Well, it's not quite the subject, but it's more around what you were saying earlier about deathbed visitations and all of those kind of end of life, people dying and hanging on, waiting for their son or whatever to come from some journey. It's a book called The Art of Dying by Peter Fenwick.
Yes.
And that he's collected together a lot of stories from the medical profession of nurses and so on, and brought them together. It's an absolutely fascinating book that really gives meat to these little stories, but how common they are, and people don't talk about them because they don't want to be seen as being a bit weird or something. But these kind of things are much more common.
Yeah.
That's part of living in a death denial society that we're frightened to bring these things up.
Totally. I hate talking about my mum all the time, but hey, this is a program about death, and it happened recently.
Yeah.
So, but I said to the staff at the care home, I sense that mum is leaving her body now. She hadn't eaten and taken liquids for a week by her choice. And she had been leaving her body a lot and seeing members of our family, which she kind of thought were real. So I knew she was traveling in and out. And they said to me, "Don't be silly, dear. She's fine. She's not even stage 2 of her end of life program."
Yeah.
So that was in the evening. The next day I insisted they took a computer into her room. They set it up. She was lying fast asleep in bed like a little innocent child, cuddling a little stuffed dog we'd bought her.
Yeah, and you've missed out, I think, an element of this story is that this was during the lockdown.
Yes, absolutely, during the lockdown, which is
there.
why we couldn't go in there, of course. And sure enough, we spent 6 hours, which really, I guess, between me and my sister was her funeral. We sang songs, we read poems, we played beautiful arias, and we just talked about her and what she would cook us and, things about her life. And that's what she passed to, was the sound of her daughters, chatting away. And I think that was a really, really beautiful way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Just very real. And I believe the last thing to go is your hearing. So she probably could hear us, but didn't know if we were in the room or not. So I have to say that I had my first really joyous experience of death with my mum, to be honest. It's always sad on an emotional level, but she was 91 and she was ready. She didn't want to be here anymore. So to go with no pain, no struggle, and no end-of-life drugs just to fall asleep is bloody marvellous, I reckon. I think she had a good innings.
Yeah, that's great.
So I'm really grateful for that experience of joy. I never thought that would be the case.
Yeah, and I think we began talking about what has changed with where we are now, and your little story there of actually being able to be really connected with your mother through technology also feeds through into funerals. A funeral that I led a few weeks ago, the son of this chap lived in China, and so he couldn't come to the funeral, though he was desperate to be there. If he had come, he would have had to have left his job and wouldn't have been allowed back into China for some weeks. So it would have been a really, really big deal. But because the funeral could be live streamed, he said, "Okay, I'm not going to come," and he could watch it online.
Yeah.
So that facility has been there for a while, but it's a little bit awkward. But I think, and the chap's sister, who was quite frail, lived in the north of England. She couldn't come, so it's made it much more.
Works for people.
Yeah, and you can connect, and the distances. We know the distances are nothing. Just as we're chatting here, as though we were in the same room together. Which would be nice, but here we are.
I think another part of that with the lockdown is that many people had not been able to be at the cremations or the funerals if they didn't have a Zoom, because early on we didn't know we could do Zoom things. That was introduced later, sort of on the cusp of when my mum had passed. And I recognise that that's a really important part of the grieving process that, because of the virus, we've been denied. And that is that when you get together with family and friends and you tell stories and you laugh about that person, you celebrate them, that's a really important part of grieving. And if you don't have that, what to do with those feelings or those stories? So that's what I've noticed, is having to deal with all of that on my own. I've not even shared it with family, really.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think not to be shy to reach out through these things like Zoom. I mean, as a small thing, I had my 70th birthday back in April, which was obviously during lockdown, and a friend of mine, Zaria, said, "Look, you should have a Zoom party." And I said, yeah, good. And then I went, "Oh no, that's going to be awful. Everyone's going to say, oh, what a nice like it," and so on. It'd be terrible. It would be really cringe making and so on. So I wasn't sure. But anyway, we did it, and I don't know how many there were. I don't know, 30, 40 people or something. All on the screen, and people around the country, and it was really nice. And people who didn't know each other, were sharing, and my daughter had made a little video, and it was, we really connected. And actually, I felt really connected to the people that were there more than if they had come to my party. Because if I'd been at a party and I'd had 40 people there, I'd have been rushing around, making sure everyone's got a drink, and oh, you need to meet this person because they're really interesting. Chat to them, and oh, hello, It would have been a completely different experience.
Yeah.
So, I think that we don't always know what's going on.
We're learning new ways, aren't we? We're learning as we go.
Yeah.
So going back to your article that I thought, the piece that you wrote about the war and why we maybe are so death phobic, you also, there were some facts that in 1910, almost everyone died in their beds at home. But now, 100 years later, in 2010, 58% of people, so it's nearly 60%, now die in hospital, and another 20% die at home. And I don't know about the other 20%, but that really shows, that clinical Western culture. Yeah,
well, the other 20% probably includes people who die in road crashes and other sort of things and so on. But there is that medicalization of death. And also the really hard part is, and as was indicated by your care home assistants, that kind of that not wanting to admit that death is okay, that it's okay to die, and that somehow we're going to patch you up anyway and kind of keep you alive.
Yeah.
Where death almost becomes a choice that we have to make, right? And this keeping people alive because that's what you do, but what do you do with the more time? Now, I've studied quite a lot with Stephen Jenkinson.
I was going to ask you.
Well, so much of what I've learned has been infused with with his great wisdom, and I highly recommend his.
Do you want to explain who he is?
Well, he is
First Nations.
Huh?
Isn't he a First Nations?
Well, he's a Canadian, and he's worked in the death trade, as he calls it, for a number of years. He's a philosopher, and he's a farmer now, but he worked in the Toronto healthcare system. He says he's sat beside 1,000 people who have died and been involved and so on. So, you know, he's gained a lot of experience, and his understandings about the cultural implications around death and dying are so fascinating. I've forgotten the story that I was gonna say when first brought him up.
Well, I think he's Indigenous. I think he was Indigenous, and he made a film called Grief Walker.
He's not Indigenous, but he has embraced some of the learnings that he's had from them. So yeah, while he has long hair, he's actually
thank you.
He's of English export. He's an English export, and so on, and. But he's really studied and reflected on the cultural implications around a death phobic society and how that manifests and what it looks like and how it's the medical profession have become the high priestesses and priests of our Western society, but the knowledge of death is denied to them, and and in that, you know, we talked earlier about what the First World War had done in terms of not telling the stories, but that's what it takes away. It takes away that connection to the past. It takes away that knowledge that there will be a future of subsequent generations, and that our responsibility in this point here and now is to hold the knowledge that we have handed down to us, and then to imbibe it and pass it on for the next generations to live and to grow on in the future, because they will. We pass that on to them, and we pass on that responsibility, and we let them go and carry on. It's okay, because this is dying. My body is dying, but life carries on, and you're the bearers of that carrying on, of that story carrying on, and we have a Remembrance Sunday. We have a Remembrance Day in this country, but all we remember are the war dead from our own side. We don't even remember the war dead of the other side, or even the civilians, probably the great number who died. We don't even remember them, and it's become worse in recent years, the way in which it's been fetishized. So I would say we would have, let's make remembrance something really a day to remember all of our ancestors.
So I'm going to remember that. Next 11th of November, we'll go out and party and celebrate everyone.
You know, most people don't really remember, you know, and one of the things that really sticks in my throat, gullet, I think is the word when you use that expression. It sounds a bit crude, but is when people say, you know, it says at the going down, we will remember them, but we don't remember them.
No,
we really don't. And you know, I only discovered, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. I had an uncle of my grandparents' generation who died in the First World War. I'd never heard about him. Never been mentioned. I can't usually in that. There's no photo I ever saw of him. No stories were told of him. You know, we don't pass down the stories. And I think the trauma of the First World War has had a big part to play in that. You know, we could look at earlier stories. I don't want to say it's the whole story. We could look at the earlier stories. I think that, you know, as English people, and I think the history of the English people is very relevant, because within my lifetime, you know, I was born in 1950. Within my lifetime, much of the globe was still painted pink, and Indian independence had only just been granted, and I spent a year as a child in Libya when it was under King Idris, and then we were in Cyprus before the island was divided and so on. And you know, anyway, the empire was still alive and thriving around the world in many parts. And I think that you know, we have this story of England of rape and pillage and plunder around the world, and that affected English people as well. We could go back to the Industrial Revolution. We could go back to the Enclosures Act, I think, that really divide. That's why England is such a class-divided society, because people could get along and kind of live together in a community, and suddenly the land was denied to them. So they had to become wage slaves. I had an interesting program about the effect of the Black Death and the trauma that that had for a long time. But we could go right back. I would go back, and some of this I've learned also from Stephen Jenkins, and go back to the Roman invasion 2,000 years ago. And our Prime Minister today will speak Latin today as an act, as speaking of high culture. You know, we think back to Romans as a kind of progenitors of our culture. So what we know about happened before the years when the Romans invaded about the culture in this country is very little. Because the Romans had a policy of, first of all, learning about a culture, chopping the heads off the leaders then afterwards, and then completely obliterating the country. And then to repeat Monty Python, you could say, well, what about the roads? Well, yeah, the Romans did the roads, but just in the same way as the Chinese are building roads in Africa, and the British and English built roads in India and so on, because it's an extractive culture.
Yeah.
Culture to suck all of the resources out and ship them back to the motherland, to the fatherland, or wherever.
Well, Taya and I have been talking about this on the show with our viewers, because Mac McCartney talked about it in the times of Queen Boudica, about 48 AD,
Yep.
how the Romans absolutely slaughtered the British tribes.
Yeah.
And then years later, I mean, they wiped out almost the Druid tradition as well. And then years later, he said, like wounded, abused children, we then went out into the world and we spread that, as in the empire and all the terrible things our forefathers did.
And
so
what happens?
It's important to go back that far. I agree.
And so one of the things that Stephen Jenkinson points out, he says, and then the English subjugated the Scots and the Irish, and then he says, so who are the best slave drivers? The Scots and the Irish, because they were enslaved effectively by the English. And what happens when you're enslaved? You say, I'm going to be like that guy. You don't say abuse is a bad thing. This happens with, with abuse in families and so on. Yeah. Abusers become abusers. But you say, I'm going to be that guy, because that is a safe place to be, is to be on the top of the pile. And that's what English people have gone around the world and done. Gone around the world and treated everybody like slaves. And we have the discussion now that is beginning, that, and it was in the newspaper even today, the problem that we have, and Brexit is the child of this idea of English exceptionalism. We don't need to share the knowledge of creating a track and trace app with other countries, because we're going to have a world-beating app ourselves. We don't need to use Galileo space satellite for GPS, because we're going to build our own, because that's what we do. Is pretty, And so this story goes on that somehow we can do whatever we like, and Boris Johnson saying, we're going to knock coronavirus on the chin and tough it out and so on, and it's just a fantasy. And here we have the largest number of deaths anywhere in the world per head of population. So this fantasy of English, not British, but English exceptionalism, needs to be addressed. Germans have dealt with their past, and they, have really healed their past. When we had the crisis of refugees, of millions of refugees coming across Europe, escaping the bombs in Syria and so on, Germany took in more than 1 million refugees. More than 1 million refugees. And how many did this country, United Kingdom, take in? I think a handful of thousands.
Handful, yeah.
Almost none.
Yeah.
And it is shameful, but it's indicative of this idea of English exceptionalism. It all feeds into that idea of othering.
And yet, I do have to say that during the war, when Nicholas, what was his name? I don't want to forget his name. Nicholas Winton laid on. He was a moneyed man, and when he laid on those 6 trains, I think they were, England was the only one who would take the Jewish children. No other countries in Europe would take those trains. So they got them out just before the war. So
But they all had to have places to go to as well.
They did. Yeah.
They all had to be arranged beforehand. So stories are mixed. There's not always just one thing or all the other. But even then, Jews were being refused visas and so on. It's not one. So often we want to put stories into black and white.
That's always great, isn't it? I just like to bring up this comment from Zofia. She says, in Poland, the dead are remembered on the 1st of November. Families visit their families' graves. It's a spectacular sight at night when all the cemeteries are twinkling in candles placed by the families to remember. I've actually, because my wife is half Polish, so I've been to Poznań on the 1st of November when they do this. It's incredibly special. We had a beautiful Polish friend of ours, Dorotka, staying with us for a few weeks. And whenever we would cook food, she in her room upstairs had her own altar where she had photographs of her ancestors. And she'd always take a little bit of the food that we were about to eat for dinner. She'd take it up and put it on her altar to honor her ancestors, so that it was constantly in her memory every day. And I thought, what a beautiful thing to do.
Yeah,
beautiful.
Yeah, we have much to learn, and I think that's been eradicated in this country over a long period of time. It's not something just with the First World War. It was eradicated, a long time before. It's interesting because actually I have on my father's side I have Polish ancestry as well. My great grandparents came over from Poland in the mid 19th century. But
Polish.
So well, my name was anglicized over time. And so on, which is a whole interesting story in its own right. But I think we'll get off the story of death and onto wider cultural issues. Everything is connected. That's the thing. And we name this talk, death in life and so on, and the two are not disconnected.
May I ask a question, Mike? Because I've seen this question come up several times, and I know Luna's got so many questions, but I'm aware that we're already an hour in. It's going so quick. I've seen this several times. People have written, "I'm interested," and how do you go about becoming a death doula, somebody to help people in that transition?
Nice question.
Well, there are two ways. One you can get some training, and I can point to a couple of people who can do that. And the other way is you get called, in the sense people come to you, and you're usually called before you think ready. That's true for most things.
Yeah.
But, if you're thinking you want to get involved in something, and you just say that thing, I want to be involved in this subject, and you sit and think about it. You can do some reading, watch the film Grief Walker, read Stephen Jenkinson's book Die Wise, whatever it is. Start to look at some of those things. So and then people will come to you, and then when the subject of death comes up, you'll respond to that. Look for the clues, because the clues will be out there. I trained as a death doula with an organization called Living Well, Dying Well, and they train people to be dying doulas. And there is also another organization, can't give you the link, run by Alexander. There's someone we can put the link in afterwards.
Well, we're going to put your slide up as well. We can put it in the comments there, but also we'll put your slide up at the end if people want to get in touch.
Well, in the Facebook link, Sacred Transition, I'll put that in there later or tomorrow to the other person who does training, Alexandra. Yeah. But so those are the two ways I think that you get involved.
I also think that just going back to the media, I think they also have a role to play, because we are never shown dead bodies, and yet we see them all the time in movies, people being shot and dead, and but they'll never show a real body. And that's why I wanted that little shot in our film of the bodies being burned on the banks of the Ghats, on the River Ganges, in Varanasi. Yeah. It's important. We're never shown dead bodies.
Yeah.
And yet we see thousands and thousands of pretend ones.
Well, yeah, and I think that it's this dichotomy. You think, well, how can we be a death-phobic society when death is in the news on the front page of the newspapers all the time?
But it's not really, is it?
It's not. It's not, as we said in this title. It's not as a part of life,
Yeah.
and to really understanding the implications.
Yeah.
You know, if we really, if we really understood the implications that we will die, and we don't know when we will die. Only it's said, those who know the Mahabharata know that only Bhima was granted the knowledge to know that he could choose the hour of his own death. And if those of you who've seen Peter Brook's marvelous interpretation of that will know when they come to him and say, "Bhima, please." When you do that, can you?
I saw that with you in our village hall. I remember that.
A marvelous night that was. Yeah, it was. Yeah. I've screened it in frame as well.
Yes.
But that's another exploration. I mean, if you want to do some other homework as well, go and watch Peter Brook's Mahabharata.
Yeah. On that subject, talking about different indigenous cultures. So, for example, from Bali, Sumatra, Tibet, Israel, Thailand, the Pacific Islands, the Arctic Circle, every culture has their different traditions with death. So was that part of your training, learning about that? And was there one that impressed you, say, more than any other?
It was a little bit, but I think what made it apparent to me was that, as you say, the traditions are quite varied, and every culture has traditions and so on. And I think that we have to find our own way based on our experience of the past. And so we have that kind of thing. But where we are now is that, to a large extent, I don't know what the percentage is in this country, but it's a relatively low, and 68% of statistics are made up on the spot. So I'm going to make which I think is that religious people in England are roughly 20%. I don't know, 25%, whatever the figure. But the number of people who feel spiritual but not religious is quite high. So when they say there's figures of people who are religious, that means adhere to a specific religion. Okay, so put them to one side. They have their own traditions of how to do things. And if you're Jewish, it's very specific. And if you're Muslim, it's very specific. And that's great. That has a great security and so on. But if you're not, you feel you need to do something. But we've been bereft, actually, of what to do, because we've abandoned structured religion and the constraints, and it feels a bit hollow what has been offered there. But that means now we have the freedom. We have to do the work ourselves. We have to say what works for us. How together as a culture do we create these new traditions? Because traditions, what are traditions? Traditions are just things that people do and then do them again and then do them again. And people say, "Oh, what's that thing that you did? Oh, well, let's do that one," and then other people, that's what a tradition is. It doesn't necessarily have a kind of mystical thing. I think that's one of the things when you look at traditions from around the world, they're quite different.
Yeah.
And I think for me, what that does is take a lot of the pressure off that when somebody dies, you've got to do it, absolutely got to do it this way. Yeah. Because if you're somewhere else, it would be like this other way. Or this other way. So when I lead a ceremony, particularly if it's a home ceremony, or particularly if it involves blessing and washing and dressing the body, the first thing I say, we gather, perhaps the dead person is there, and we gather around in a circle around and say, "Look, James, Matilda, whoever it is, we may get some of this wrong, and I'm sorry, but we're doing the best we can here, and we want to honor you and love you," and so on. And I think that's, it takes a lot of the preciousness and tension out of it, that it has to be this man, or predominantly a man, with special robes, and has to incantate these special things and so on. But we can do this. We have to look within ourselves, and we can learn from traditions. We can take things like your example from Poland, Theo.
Corona.
So we can learn from other traditions, but we don't have to take them lock, stock, and barrel, and to just adopt them as new clothes that really are not necessarily our own either.
Yeah.
Look at the examples. What works for us, and the key is to be involved. The key is to be involved when somebody dies in the process. You don't just ring the funeral director and say, "Oh, can you arrange everything for you?" And I'll turn up at 11:30 on Tuesday to the service and so on. The more that you're involved with the person who's dying and making their arrangements, the more healing it will be.
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah.
And to have those conversations. There's a very good book. I thought I had it on my desk here, but I seem to have. No, I don't. It's called the Healing Hand, and it talks about the five things. There's a little test to see if I can remember to say to somebody when they die. Okay, this is going to be interesting. Thank you is the one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is I forgive you. Please forgive me. We love you. Goodbye. We let you go.
So it's Ho'oponopono with a goodbye at the end.
Yeah, very similar.
Yeah.
But the goodbye is like we let you go. Goodbye is very important.
Yeah.
Because that's the role that a priest would play, or somebody would play to say it's okay to go now. And when somebody is ill, to say it's okay, mother. We let you go. There's an example. My partner Celia looked after a lady, for care, and all she wanted was to have a proper conversation with her daughter. But her daughter would arrive twice a week with food, push the food in the fridge, and say, "All right, mum," and rush out the door. All she wanted was that, and she would every day she would wake up and say, "Oh, I'm still here." Oh, okay.
Yeah.
She wanted to die all the time, but she has now descended into dementia and doesn't even recognize the daughter. And so she's lost that opportunity to choose to go.
So sad.
It's a much more active process, I think, than people realize.
Yeah, definitely. Shall we? We've got 15 minutes left. Teo, should we talk about transition towns? Transition town movements?
Yeah, we can do. I just think this is such a fascinating subject. Maybe we could talk about transition towns another time. But it depends. I mean, it depends. There's so many things. I mean, I would love to ask you, Mike.
Yeah.
Because there's a friend of mine that's watching, and there is there's things going on in that family where they would love, I think, the answer to this question is, having dealt with what you've dealt with so many times over the years, what's the best way that people can prepare themselves for the forthcoming departure of a loved one? What's the best way to equip yourself to be ready for that grief? I mean, my father passed in 2005 when he was only 60. And I remember that, when those waves of grief hit you, they are literally like waves. And in the beginning, it's like a storm. It just feels huge. Yeah. And you just, you wake up, you feel sick, and you just don't know you don't know how you're going to put one foot in front of the other next.
Yeah.
But then eventually the waves become less and less. And then you suddenly think, oh, it's been 2 days and I've not even thought about that person. And it's incredible how the body does and the mind does have the ability to do it. But what in your experience, what sort of tools could you share with people if they are struggling with grief or could potentially be having to deal with grief in the future?
Well,
good question, Teo.
It's two different questions, really. But the first one that was the main thrust was how do you prepare before it happens, and so, which I think is quite interesting. And I think one of those things is to make sure you've had those conversations. Those really deep conversations.
Yeah.
I don't think that there'll be another time. There'll be another time. I can tell you, if you talk to a hospital doctors and so on, who will be the number of times they've had people clinging onto their sleeves saying, "Please do what you can. I need to have that last conversation with Dad." Your dad is 97. And he's had cancer for 2 years. You knew he was dying of it. Did you not think, Yeah. So have those conversations. Have your peace with that, But and those 5 things that I said, you can say that, you can do those things at any time. I love you, I let you go, I forgive you, because we all carry hurts from our childhood and so on, however wonderful our parental handling was, for sure, and they probably carry hurts that they never dared to bring up, because we so easily hurt our own parents, and so on. So to have that heart to say, I had that moment where I said I'm sorry, for whatever it was, and I can, and my dad or whoever it is will go, that I really had that moment, but not to over press them to talk about the things they don't want to.
Yes.
It's like it's their death, and it's, I wrote a poem a while ago, because when my dad was dying, he, I described it as the locks on his memory chest no longer worked, and little stories would come out in his kind of little bit of dementia and so on, of his war experiences, of somebody being killed right next to him and stuff that he'd never talked about before. So, those, but that was his choice. I couldn't press him to talk more. I could be present when he shared, but I couldn't ask for more. That was his right to the end, to take that with him. But you can be present, and you can be responsive when that opportunity comes. So and I think that's the key. And so here's a little story. I think we've got time to wrap up afterwards. But I was having relationship therapy at the time when my dad was dying, and there came a point where it really looked like he was dying. And my therapist heard that my dad was still alive, and said, "My goodness, this is such an opportunity for you to deal with those past hurts, and that will really influence to this work that we're doing here." And my dad was, he couldn't, he'd got to the point he had a dementia and so on, and he couldn't, he could talk to himself, but he couldn't really go back into the past and stuff. So, and I wanted to say something, but I wanted it to be rounded. So I wrote a script. And I had this script, like in the, I don't know what I've got, in my back pocket. I had this script in my back pocket that I'd every time I went there, I had it there. And I thought, today, I'm gonna bring this script out, and I'm gonna build a thing, the nice things and the difficult things. And so every day went by, and I couldn't do it. And then this particular day, I had to take the train to London. Now, I was reading a book at the time by Joanna Macy. And the beginning of this particular chapter was an extract from, oh crikey, my memory is gone. It's from, it'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, it's the story of a man who goes on a long quest. It's an ancient story, Parsifal, story Parsifal, and he meets the Fisher King at the lake. I'm trying to tell it quickly. He takes him back to his castle. He's treated royally with wonderful food and accommodation. Goes back after his long quest to his returning castle, greeted as a returning hero, except this old hag who says, "You're not a hero at all. You were given to visit the Fisher King, and you never asked him what ailed him, what was wrong with him, because the whole court was actually sick. You never asked him." And overcome with grief, he goes back many, many years looking for it, eventually finds it and says, "Sire, what ails thee?" And he asked the question, and in naming the thing, the whole court was healed. Okay, so that's the story. I read that story on the train of this particular day. Just happened. That afternoon, I went to visit my dad, and he's lying there. He's not beyond sitting up now. I think he's probably, coming to his end. And I hold his hand, and I sit with him for an hour and so on. And then eventually gets to the point, I said, "Dad, I'm going home now. I'll see you tomorrow." And he says, he says, "Who am I?" He'd never said anything remotely like this. So I'm going, "Ooh, yes, who am I? Who are you? Who am I?" And my pocket is burning, and as I'm pulling out my script out of my pocket, he says, "What's my story?" So I say, "Dad, I don't know. your story. I've sat with you for 1.5 years, and you haven't really told me your story. But this is my story, and I told him, you know, the lovely things and the things that I'd struggled with and so on. Told him the whole thing, and I skipped out of there like, you know, a newborn. You know, well, no, newborn child don't skip, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
And anyway, the next day, I get to the nursing home and knock on the door. The matron opens the door. Oh, have you seen your dad? And I thought, oh my God, he's nearly died and they haven't rung me up. And she was couldn't make any sense at all. Completely. Anyway, I went upstairs to his room. There he is. He's sitting up, watching TV. I can see the chart that he's been eating and drinking. He's making rude jokes with the nurses again and so on. You know, this is a man who'd been lying, you know, for, I don't know, several weeks, you know, without hardly any sign of life, completely transformed. So not only did it heal me, it healed him. But that was that one moment in that whole time that moment was there.
It was appropriate.
So that's what I'm saying, is that be alert to that opportunity.
Yeah.
Asked about how do I train as a doula? You be alert to the opportunity when it comes. Don't say, oh, Dad, don't, you know, like you were saying, Nikki, that the nurses said, oh, don't be silly, you know, you know, you're going to be fine. And, you know, many people do the same, say, oh, you're going to be fine. I heard a story once of somebody a doula who went to visit somebody. It's real quick. And as they opened the door, the children of this lady said, look, whatever you do, don't let Mum know that she's dying. She goes into the room with Mum. She says, look, whatever you do, don't tell the children that I'm dying. You know?
It's interesting that you say allow things to come to you, because I think it is about alignment, and when it's right to do that work, or when you're meant to, you'll know about it. And I obviously sat with my dad 25 years ago and had a total role reversal moment with him where I became the parent and he was just crying like a baby. And I had a friend who had traveled to Heathrow taking his very sick girlfriend to the cancer clinic, the Mayo Clinic, is it? Mm-hmm. And they were stuck at the airport for 48 hours. I said, don't be silly, come and stay at my place in London. And she died in my bed. She spent 10 days. She was too sick to be moved any further. And I had that amazing honor for 10 days, just giving her little juices and recognizing when to call in what are the beautiful cancer nurses called? You know, but it landed literally on my doorstep. And another family paid for me to go up to Scotland because they knew I was close and they knew nothing they didn't feel comfortable, and they knew I had a spiritual connection with this girlfriend. And it happens.
Mary,
and you react in the way you're going to react. Yeah. Oh, Mike, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
And you realize there is so much to talk about. When we finally get talking, there is so much to say about it. Really.
Well, and Theo's just put the link to my my new website, dyingtotalk.org. Actually, it's .org.uk, actually, Theo.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me fix that for you.
Thank you. But I've realised that, as you say, Nikki, that this death and dying is such a big subject. I'm actually going to be starting my own series of podcasts just on this subject quite soon. So I'm just working on the logistics of that.
Keep an eye on your Facebook page.
Thank you, on the Sacred Transition. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and the cultural implications as well. And you know, we're only going to get out of this denial by talking about it, and that I think is the key.
Beautiful.
So much. Thank you. So let me just pull those details up for those people that can't see the comments for any reason. So there is Mike's website. So it's dyingtotalk.org.uk, and he has a Facebook group, facebook.com/sacred transition. And we're live currently. We've had over 200 people watching tonight because we're live across Facebook, YouTube, and our Facebook page and our Facebook group. Our Facebook group just hit 28,000 members, which, considering we only started last October, is pretty amazing. just shows how many people around the world are really loving to be a part of this community. And if you'd like to watch the Time of the Sixth Sun series for free, you're able to do so. Just go to timeofthesixthsunlaunch.com. We do these talks twice a week, absolutely free of charge for all of you guys. We have huge technology costs, like $1,500 a month just to keep everything going. And so if anybody would like to throw, $3, $4, $5, $10 our way, then we do have a donate page that I'm just going to put into the comments now. And if you can't do any of that, you can just share the live videos with others. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. Let me just see if I can get this slide back down. Multitasking, but Mike, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for making this whole series of interviews free online. It's a great blessing. You've interviewed some really interesting people, and I'm very humbled to be invited to be among them. Thank you.
It's just, we've had such varied people, and yet everyone's right in their own way and comes up with such wealth of information. I know you've enjoyed them as well, Tay, but I've absolutely loved doing them. We earn no money, literally, for it. It takes me 2 days for each interview to prepare and to write for and everything. And yet it is a joy. I really enjoy doing it. Do you, Taya? Yeah,
I do. It's great. Yeah. It's great. It's lovely. So we've got 2 more next week. We're doing our live at 8:00 on Monday and our live on next Thursday at 8:00. And then we're going to take a well-earned rest. So we're going to take 3 weeks off, and we'll be back on the 17th of August. And from August onwards, Nikki and I have discussed it. And actually, I have to do a lot of prep with the tech set up, and because we're doing these launches every Tuesday. So we're sort of splitting the roles. But it does take, I spoke to Nikki. She said it's taken her almost, a day to sit and write all the questions for you, Mike. And I could show you a Word document that's sitting behind this screen here where there are so many more questions that we never even got to ask. And so we've decided we're going to continue these live broadcasts, but we're just going to do them once a week on a Monday night, because it's a huge amount of work to actually do these. And then we just decided we're going to do it once a week, because
we're doing next.
I'm not putting my little ones to bed, and they're of an age where I don't really want to be missing these opportunities. So
we're doing next Monday and next Thursday. Next Thursday we have the fabulous Pat McCabe coming back on, Navajo. And Navajo Dine, and then we're having a 3-week break, and our next one will be on the 17th of August.
Monday,
and they will be Mondays only ever after that, from the 17th onwards, every Monday. And also we have some exciting news which we'll announce next week, which is one of our very first shamanic seminars that we're putting on for one of our speakers, and we'll do probably one a month. So we'll give you some news of that next week. Anyway, thoroughly enjoyed it, and have loved you guys for the last 4 months sticking with us. And so don't forget to come back and tell people. 17th of August, that's when we come back, but we've got 2 next week.
We've got 2 next week. Let's not confuse people and think that we're stopping now. We're not. We're stopping as of after next Thursday. So what I don't even know what date that will be. So thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you on the 20th of July, the 23rd of July, because we have to also remember that these are also watched. I mean, we've had 200 people watching live, but like the talk that we did with Shamuel on Monday, I think it's been viewed over 4,000 times since Monday on Facebook alone. That's not including YouTube. That's not including the Facebook group. So these things get watched and watched afterwards. So
he was absolutely fantastic, that boy. If you haven't seen it, Mike, look at the one we did last Thursday. Really fantastic. Last Monday.
What was the name again?
His name is Hamuel Kryan, and he's a 16-year-old boy who had such a difficult childhood growing up. He's a highly sensitive person, highly developed, ambidextrous. He was explaining to us how his brain is wired differently and how he processes differently. Mm-hmm. And he's had a real hard time, head banging to get the noise out of his head. I mean, really an emotive story. And he was calm. He was zen. He'd been highly stressed that day, but he just was magnificent. Oh. And I hope to do a lot more with him in the future. He's a fantastic fellow.
And we'll be saying the same thing about you next Monday, Mike. Thank you for all.
I feel obliged.
Yeah, I've put Mike's. I'll edit the descriptions to add all of Mike's links in there. And so thank you so much, and we'll see you on Monday. Good night.
Great.
Stay with us, Mike, for a moment, but everyone else, good night.
Good.